Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, Russia has really been pounding Ukrainian cities, some that haven't seen this kind of offensive since really the beginning of the invasion, the beginning of the war. Talk a little bit about the state of play.
So, as we look back over the last week, we have seen a real change in what's going on the ground in Ukraine. Starting earlier this week, we saw Russia launch a massive missile campaign, a bombardment. But as you said, it wasn't just in the east where most of the fighting has been for many months now. But this bombardment is taking place all over Ukraine, including in the capital of Kyiv.
Right.
And Kyiv hasn't been a part of the battlegrounds of the war for many months now. So this campaign from Russia over the last week has greatly expanded the scope of the war, for lack of a better term. But it's also important to know that this really isn't a scope of the expanding the scope of the battleground, because we've heard from both the UN and U.S. defense officials that these strikes look like they are actually war crimes.
Right.
It
Targeting
looks
civilians.
Exactly, and civilian infrastructure. We saw even earlier today a high-rise in Kyiv get hit. And we also have found out that one of the reasons the U.S. believes this is happening is Russia is being increasingly forced to rely on dumb munitions or non-guided precise missiles, which is why a lot of these civilian infrastructures could have been hit. And so one thing that they have done is Russia has gone to Iran for drones.
Right.
And so we've seen that, and we've seen according to Ukrainian officials, them used in this bombardment that we're seeing over the course of the last week or so. Now, we know the death toll is in the 20s, and there are hundreds who have been wounded, which just raises the overall death toll that we know to be in the thousands, but don't really have a firmer grasp of at this point.
So obviously the humanitarian toll is very, very bad, but geopolitically, maybe this hasn't had the impact that Russia wants, especially in terms of what it's done to Western resolve.
Absolutely. So we've heard from the very beginning that NATO would stay aligned, and they have for the most part. We've seen some hiccups along the way in different countries and different governments wanting different things or being willing to provide different levels of military aid to Ukraine. But for by and large, they have really held firm, which Russia has said was to drive a wedge between Western allies. And so they have, NATO has remained very committed to Ukraine. We saw them meet at NATO headquarters this week. It was attended by Secretary Austin and General Milley, the chair of the Joint Staff. And during that meeting, which was attended by defense ministers or representatives by over 50 countries, we heard them come out of those meetings with a strong resolve to not only help Ukraine, but specifically to help their air defense systems. And so earlier this week, we saw Germany confirm that their state-of-the-art new air defense system that they haven't even been able to use yet is actually already, they've promised for to Ukraine, and the first one has reached there. We've seen the U.S. increase the number of air defense systems that they've said they were providing to Ukraine increase over the last couple of weeks. And we heard earlier this week that they're trying to expedite the speed with which Ukraine will get them, though at this point they still remain weeks away, not days.
Because air defense is obviously the big Ukrainian ask. They think that this is really what could keep them really fighting in the war.
Absolutely. And it's important to note that throughout the course of the war, there has been no primary winner of the airspace. It is still contested airspace. That's something the Pentagon has said for months now, that neither side is really having a dominant control of the air in this war.
Now, we've heard some nuclear talk in recent weeks. What is the current status? What do people really think? Because obviously there are some leaders who say that they are very concerned about Russia's use of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine, and others think it's very unlikely, including some of the same people.
So it's important to know that the U.S. and Western allies do seem to be taking seriously the threat that Vladimir Putin will use a nuclear weapon, and he has said as much. He said for months now that he is not afraid to use a nuclear weapon. That being said, that concern seems to have become more crystallized recently as Russia's losses on the battlefield continue to mount. We've seen them continue to lose ground over the last couple weeks as Ukraine has launched counteroffensives, and we've seen that things that President Putin has done, like calling up 300,000 reserve forces, hasn't made much of an impact on the war itself on the ground. And so with him running out of options, there is a concern that he could resort to using a tactical nuclear weapon. And we know Russia's nuclear doctrine is that they believe they can get away with doing something like this without incurring a subsequent nuclear response. Now, we know for a fact, in part, that French President Emmanuel Macron said earlier this week that they wouldn't respond with a nuclear weapon. And so from that perspective, it does actually prove Russia's nuclear doctrine. That being said, we saw President Joe Biden earlier this week say, while he doesn't believe at this point that Putin would use one, he believes it could lead to Armageddon.
Right.
And so we heard the president use the word Armageddon in an interview after he used it at a fundraiser and made pretty significant headlines. But at the same time, even with the president using that type of language, White House officials and defense officials maintain to this day that they haven't seen any reason to change U.S. nuclear posture.
Right, because Biden's essentially making the point that he doesn't think you really can have this limited, little itty-bitty use of a nuclear weapon and not have it blow up into, no pun intended, into a much larger problem.
Absolutely.
Right.
And so what Biden's saying is we don't know what would happen. There's it would be so much gunpowder ready to explode in our faces. There's no telling what could happen.
Anyone who would do this, this could really expand into a much larger problem beyond what Putin may be intending.
Absolutely.
So finally, at the time we're filming this, there haven't been any developments with Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan, two Americans who are held in Russian custody. But you've noticed an interesting development that could augur some hope for that.
So we don't know really what it entails, but we do know that the Russian ambassador to the U.S. visited Victor Bout earlier this week. Now we know Victor Bout is nicknamed the Merchant of Death for his arms sales to alleged war criminals in various countries in Africa. And so he's been serving a 25-year prison sentence in the U.S. for a long time now. His sentence only has a few years left, and eventually he will be released. And so his name has been has been connected with Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan as a potential component to a prisoner swap. And so with the Russian ambassador visiting him earlier this week, it raises speculation about something that could be in the pipelines. Now, we also heard President Biden say this week that there really hasn't been much movement on the ground, though we did hear him actually say he would consider meeting with President Putin at next month's G20 summit if it's to talk about Brittany or Paul. And so while we don't know exactly sort of any updates in terms of these discussions, it does raise some, it is noteworthy, let's say, that the Russian ambassador did visit Victor Bout, given how prominent his name has been associated in a potential swap for Brittany Griner and Paul Whelan.
Well, let's hope that can happen for them. Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.